Spring 1943. Across the Pacific, American ships were burning, not from enemy action alone, but from the chaos that followed. Fuel lines ruptured, ammunition cooked off, watertight doors jammed shut, and in those first terrible minutes when smoke-filled compartments and sailors scrambled in darkness, survival depended less on courage than on preparation. Fire, they were learning, was not a battle. It was a logistics problem. Somewhere on the East Coast, behind chain-link fences and concrete walls, a new kind of training facility was rising. It wasn't a barracks. It wasn't a firing range. It was a school built to burn, deliberately, methodically, again and again. Inside, young sailors would learn to fight not with rifles but with hoses, foam canisters, and the cold mathematics of oxygen deprivation. They would be taught that fire spreads according to predictable rules, that panic kills faster than flames, and that the difference between a ship lost and a ship saved often came down to seconds and supply chains. This is the story of that school, of the men who passed through its scorching compartments, of the instructors who set fires with clinical precision, and of the doctrine that emerged from those flames, a doctrine built on the fragile truth that war is won not only by those who can strike, but by those who can endure, contain, and rebuild while the battle still rages. Before we continue, subscribe and turn on the bell. Here we tell real, untold stories of World War II, stories of fire, discipline, and the quiet engineering victories that history almost forgot. Chapter 1. The School That Burns on Purpose. The facility appeared unremarkable from the outside, a cluster of steel structures, smokestacks, and water towers arranged along a desolate stretch of coastline. No flags flew, no ceremonies marked its opening. But inside, something unprecedented was taking shape. A ship that would never sail, built solely to teach men how to keep burning vessels afloat. The mock-up was a replica of a destroyer's interior. Narrow passageways, steep ladders, machinery compartments packed with pipes and valves. Everything was real except the destination, the steel walls, the electrical panels, the fuel lines running overhead, even the ammunition magazines, stocked with training rounds that could still explode if mishandled. It was a ship designed to fail over and over, so that real ships wouldn't. The sailors arrived in waves, hundreds each week, fresh from boot camp, most of them teenagers who had never been to sea. They came from farms, factories, small towns where fire meant a chimney spark or a barn lost to lightning. They had no concept of what fire meant aboard a warship, the speed, the heat, the impossibility of escape when every hatch led deeper into smoke. Their first lesson began before they even entered the training compartments. An instructor, his face weathered and voice flat, stood before them holding a single match. He struck it, let it burn halfway, then placed it carefully into a metal tin and sealed the lid. The flame died instantly. Fire needs three things, he said. Fuel, heat, oxygen. Take away anyone and it dies. That's not philosophy. That's chemistry. And chemistry doesn't care if you're scared. The sailors watched the smoke curl from the tin's edges. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward, trying to understand. The instructor opened the tin again, exposing the charred matchstick. Out here you control those three things. Out there, he gestured toward the ocean beyond the fence. Fire controls you. The ship is full of fuel. The engine room is full of heat. And the air you breathe is the oxygen feeding every flame. Your job is to break that cycle before the ship breaks apart. He paused, scanning their faces. This school exists because we learned the hard way. Ships burned not because sailors lacked courage, but because they lacked systems. Fire suppression isn't heroism, it's logistics, and logistics can be taught. They were divided into teams, damage control parties, each assigned specific roles. Nozzlemen who would aim the hoses, hosemen who would manage the lines, phone talkers who would relay orders through smoke-filled chaos. Investigators who would enter compartments first, assessing what burned and what could still be saved, and repair specialists who carried wooden plugs, metal patches, and canvas sheets to seal ruptured bulkheads. The instructors explained the doctrine with mechanical precision. Firefighting aboard a ship wasn't about dousing flames. It was about isolating them, sealing compartments, flooding magazines before ammunition cooked off, venting smoke without feeding oxygen to the blaze. Every action required coordination, timing, and an understanding of how fire moved through a ship's circulatory system. You're not fighting one fire, an officer told them during the first briefing. You're fighting a chain reaction. Stop it early, and you save the ship. Let it spread, and you're abandoning her within the hour. The training began with controlled burns. Small fires set in isolated compartments, oil-soaked rags, electrical panels deliberately short-circuited, fuel spills ignited under supervision. The sailors entered in full gear, helmets, gloves, breathing apparatus strapped to their backs. The heat hit them like a wall. The smoke turned the passageway into a black tunnel, and the noise, the roar of flames, the hiss of water turning to steam, the clang of metal expanding, overwhelmed every instinct to flee. Their first attempts were clumsy. Hoses kinked, nozzles sprayed wildly. Men stumbled over each other in the dark, shouting orders that no one could hear. The instructors watched without intervening, letting them fail, letting the fire win. Then they called a halt, cleared the smoke, and walked the teams through their mistakes. You turned the nozzle too wide. That wastes water pressure and feeds steam back into your face. You didn't vent the compartment first. Now you're just moving smoke around. Your hose team lost communication. Half of you thought you were advancing. The other half was retreating. That's how men get trapped. They ran the drill again and again. Each time the instructors added complexity. A jammed hatch, a ruptured fuel line spraying fire across the deck, a casualty who needed evacuation while flames blocked the exit. The scenarios grew harder, faster, more chaotic, not to break the sailors but to build the muscle memory that would keep them alive when chaos became real. By the end of the first week they understood. Fire wasn't the enemy. Disorganization was. Now tell us in the comments where you're watching from and how far these forgotten wartime stories have reached. Your voice helps keep memory alive. Chapter 2. The Mathematics of Survival. The classroom sessions felt strangely disconnected from the burns. The sailors sat in rows, notebooks open, while instructors drew diagrams on chalkboards, cross-sections of ship compartments, fuel distribution systems, ventilation pathways. It looked more like an engineering lecture than combat training, but the lessons were anything but theoretical. A destroyer carries approximately 75,000 gallons of fuel oil. The instructor began, tapping the diagram. That's distributed across multiple tanks, fed through pipelines to the boilers and engines. When a torpedo hits, it doesn't just puncture the hull, it ruptures those lines. Fuel sprays into compartments. Heat from the explosion ignites it, and within seconds, you have a fire moving faster than you can run. He turned to face them. Your job isn't to outrun it, it's to predict where it's going and cut it off. The sailors learned to read a ship's layout like a map of veins and arteries. They memorized which compartments held ammunition, which bulkheads were reinforced, which ventilation ducts could carry smoke, or flames, from one end of the ship to the other. They studied the priority list. Flooding a magazine took precedence over saving a galley. Sealing a fuel line mattered more than extinguishing a small electrical fire. It was cold logic, stripped of sentiment, but it worked. Fire spreads along 3 axes, another instructor explained, vertically through ladders and hatches, horizontally through passageways, and invisibly through ventilation systems. If you don't control all 3, you're just chasing it in circles. They practiced with scale models, miniature ships with removable compartments, tiny figures representing damage control teams. The instructors would simulate a hit. Torpedo strike, starboard side, frame 52, fuel fire spreading aft. The sailors had to plot their response in real time, deciding which hatches to seal, which teams to deploy, which systems to prioritize. Mistakes were immediate and visible. Seal the wrong hatch, and you trapped your own men. Flood a compartment too early, and you destabilize the ship's list. Wait too long to vent smoke, and heat built until the bulkheads buckled. You're managing resources, the instructor reminded them. Water, foam, manpower, time. All of it is finite. Use it wrong and the ship sinks. Use it right, and she stays afloat long enough to fight back. The sailors began to see fire not as chaos, but as a puzzle with knowable variables. Oxygen concentration, fuel load, structural integrity, ventilation flow. Every factor could be measured, predicted, controlled, what if they acted fast enough, but theory only carried them so far. The real test waited in the burn compartments. Chapter 3. The First Real Fire. The compartment was darker than they expected. Smoke poured from the hatchway, thick and black, obscuring even the emergency lighting. The heat reached them before they entered, a radiating pressure that made breathing feel like swallowing coals. Somewhere inside, flames roared against metal, and the structure groaned under thermal stress. "Move!" the instructor shouted. The first team entered in formation, nozzle man leading, hoseman trailing behind, phone talker coordinating with topside. Their breathing apparatus hissed with each inhalation. The world narrowed to what their gloved hands could touch: the hose line, the bulkhead, the valve they needed to reach. The fire was larger than the training burns. It consumed an entire corner of the compartment, fed by a deliberately ruptured fuel line that sprayed accelerant across the deck. The flames climbed the walls, licked at overhead pipes, and generated a heat so intense that the sailors' visors fogged within seconds. "Isolate the fuel source," the instructor's voice crackled over the radio. "Secondary team vent through the starboard hatch." They moved through the drill, muscle memory overriding panic. The nozzle man opened the hose with a controlled spray, targeting the base of the fire rather than the flames themselves. The hoseman fed the line forward, keeping tension steady. The phone talker relayed updates. Fire contained to frame 12, fuel valve located, requesting permission to seal. But then something went wrong. A steam pipe overhead ruptured from the heat, venting a scalding cloud directly into their path. The nozzle man stumbled backward, colliding with the hoseman. The line kinked. Water pressure dropped, and for 5 terrible seconds the fire surged forward unchecked. "Hold position," the instructor barked. "Don't retreat. Unkink that line and re-establish flow." They did, hands shaking, vision obscured, lungs burning despite the breathing apparatus. The nozzleman repositioned. The hoseman straightened the line. Water surged forward again and the flames began to retreat. 15 minutes later the fire was out. The compartment smoldered, dripping water and foam, the air thick with the acrid smell of burnt oil and scorched paint. The sailors emerged one by one, removing their masks, coughing, eyes red from smoke exposure despite their gear. The instructor waited outside, arms crossed. He didn't congratulate them. He didn't critique their mistakes. He simply said, "That was training. On a real ship you wouldn't have 15 minutes. You'd have 5, and if you failed, 200 men would be swimming in burning oil." He let that sink in. Run it again. They did, again and again, until the fear became routine, until the heat became expected, until the chaos resolved into steps they could execute even when exhausted, even when terrified, even when every instinct screamed to abandon ship. Because fire, they were learning, didn't care about courage. It cared about oxygen, fuel, and heat, and the sailors who survived were the ones who controlled those variables faster than the flames could spread. Chapter 4. The Supply Chain. Behind the flame. Behind every burn drill, behind every simulated catastrophe, was a logistics operation most sailors never saw. The school didn't just teach firefighting, it sustained it, and that required infrastructure as complex as any naval engagement. The fuel for the training fires came from dedicated storage tanks, carefully measured and monitored. Not too much, or the fires became uncontrollable. Not too little, or the drills lost their realism. Engineers calibrated the flow rates, ensuring each burn replicated the conditions sailors would face at sea: oil fires, electrical fires, ammunition-fed fires, and the hybrid infernos that combined all three. The water came from a dedicated pumping station, capable of delivering thousands of gallons per minute through a network of pipes that mirrored a warship's firefighting mains. Pressure had to remain constant, too high, and hoses became unmanageable, too low, and foam wouldn't suppress the flames. Maintenance crews worked around the clock, checking valves, replacing worn seals, testing backup systems. The foam itself was a chemical marvel, a mixture that smothered flames by creating an oxygen-blocking blanket. But it had to be mixed precisely. Wrong ratios rendered it useless. Supply officers tracked inventory with the same rigor they applied to ammunition. How many canisters remained? How long until the next shipment? What alternatives existed if supplies ran short? And the gear, helmets, gloves, breathing apparatus, protective suits, required constant inspection. A cracked faceplate, a faulty regulator, a torn glove. Any failure could mean severe burns or smoke inhalation. Teams rotated through the equipment bays after every drill, checking, cleaning, repairing, replacing. One sailor, assigned to logistics rotation, spent his days not fighting fires but ensuring others could. He inventoried hose nozzles, tested pressure gauges, restocked first aid kits. It wasn't glamorous, but he understood its importance. If a nozzle fails during a real fire, men die, his supervisor told him. Your job is to make sure that never happens. The instructors themselves were veterans of ship fires. Men who had fought flames aboard damaged carriers, cruisers, destroyers. They brought scars, both visible and otherwise. One had lost hearing in his left ear from an explosion. Another walked with a limp from a bulkhead collapse. They didn't talk about their experiences unless asked, but their teaching carried the weight of memory. I watched a fire spread through 3 compartments because one hatch wasn't sealed properly, an instructor told a group during a classroom session. The gasket was worn, the dogs were loose, and when the pressure built, smoke poured through. We lost 4 men trying to contain what should have been a localized burn. He paused. That's why we check every seal, every valve, every inch of hose, because fire doesn't forgive shortcuts. The school's doctrine rested on this principle. Survival at sea required not just trained sailors but reliable systems. Every piece of equipment had to function under extreme conditions. Every supply line had to remain unbroken. Every backup plan needed a backup. If this story has moved you, leave a like. It helps others discover how humanity can survive even inside the walls of captivity. Chapter 5. When the drills became real, news arrived in fragments. Radio reports, letters from the fleet, debriefings from returning sailors, ships damaged, ships saved, ships lost, and with each account, the instructors adjusted their drills, incorporating lessons written in blood and seawater. A carrier had taken a kamikaze strike near the flight deck. Fuel ignited. Ammunition cooked off. But the damage control teams had isolated the fire, flooded the surrounding compartments, and kept the ship operational long enough to recover aircraft and retreat. The school added a new drill, fighting fires while maintaining combat readiness. A destroyer had been torpedoed amidships. The blast severed fuel lines and ruptured the fire main, leaving the crew without water pressure, but they'd improvised, using portable pumps, bucket brigades, even seawater scooped directly from the ocean. The ship limped into port. The school added scenarios involving total system failure. And then there were the losses. A cruiser that burned for 6 hours before being abandoned. A transport ship where smoke overwhelmed the ventilation system, suffocating men below decks. A tanker that exploded after a small electrical fire spread to fuel stores. These weren't training failures. They were real ships, real crews, real consequences. The instructors didn't hide these stories. They used them. This is what happens when doctrine breaks down, one said, pointing to photographs of a burned-out hull. This is what we're preparing you to prevent. The sailors listened with a new intensity. The burns they endured in training weren't just exercises. They were rehearsals for moments that would determine whether their shipmates lived or died. One afternoon, a veteran sailor arrived at the school to give a guest lecture. He'd survived a fire aboard a destroyer in the Pacific. His hands bore scars from handling hot metal without gloves. His voice was hoarse from smoke inhalation that had never fully healed. "We thought we were ready," he began. "We'd done the drills. We knew the procedures. But when the fire started, nothing went according to plan." He described the chaos. Communications cut off. Half the damage control team trapped below decks. Equipment failures cascading faster than they could respond. They fought the fire for 3 hours with improvised tools. Blankets soaked in seawater, axes used to break through jammed hatches, sailors forming human chains to pass buckets when the hoses ran dry. "We saved the ship," he said, "but barely, and only because someone remembered something they'd learned in training. Some small detail about venting smoke, or sealing a bulkhead, or prioritizing the magazine over the galley." He looked at the sailors in front of him. "You'll forget most of what they teach you here. That's normal. But the things you remember, the reflexes, the instincts, the logistics, those will save your life, and everyone else's." The room was silent. The instructors resumed training the next morning with renewed urgency. They ran the sailors harder, added more variables, increased the heat and complexity of every drill, because the war was still being fought, and somewhere in the Pacific, another ship would soon be burning. Chapter 6. The Fragile Engineering of Hope. The most difficult lesson wasn't about fire. It was about what came after. A ship could survive the flames and still be lost, not to enemy action, but to structural failure, flooding, or the slow collapse of systems damaged beyond immediate repair. The sailors learned to assess not just whether a fire was out, but whether the ship could still fight, still sail, still make it home. They studied stability calculations, how flooding one compartment affected buoyancy, how sealing bulkheads changed the ship's center of gravity, how too much water in the wrong place could cause a list that became a roll that became a capsize. Fire suppression and damage control were inseparable. One drill involved a simulated torpedo hit that flooded 2 compartments and started a fire in a third. The sailors had to decide, fight the fire first or counter flood to prevent capsizing. Wrong choice and the ship would either burn or sink. Correct choice, and both threats could be managed. Barely. Engineering isn't about perfect solutions, an instructor reminded them. It's about acceptable compromises. You won't save everything. You'll lose compartments. You'll lose equipment. Sometimes you'll lose men. But if you keep the ship afloat and operational, you've succeeded. The sailors practiced emergency repairs, welding patches over ruptures, shoring up weakened bulkheads with wooden beams, rerouting electrical systems around damaged sections. They learned to think in terms of priorities. Propulsion first, steering second, weapons third, everything else expendable. They also learned the limits of what could be fixed at sea. Some damage required a shipyard. Some casualties required a hospital. Some fires left compartments too warped and scorched to ever be habitable again. The doctrine taught them to recognize when to fight and when to isolate and move on. Your job isn't to restore the ship to perfect condition, an officer explained during a briefing. Your job is to keep her alive long enough to reach help. The sailors absorbed this with quiet determination. They weren't heroes. They were engineers of survival, calculating, coordinating, executing procedures designed to buy time, preserve function, and deliver damaged ships back to port. And in that purpose, they found something unexpected, not glory, but the fragile engineering of hope, the belief that even broken things could be made to work, that even a ship on fire could be saved, that logistics, discipline, and preparation mattered more than luck. Chapter 7. The Fire That Never Stops. The training intensified in the final weeks. The burns grew longer, hotter, more chaotic. Multiple fires set simultaneously, communications deliberately disrupted, key personnel removed from drills to simulate casualties. The instructors pushed the sailors to exhaustion, then pushed them further. You don't get to choose when the fire starts, one instructor said. You don't get to be rested, or prepared, or confident. You fight it anyway. They ran night drills. Fires fought in total darkness with only hand signals and touch to guide them. They ran drills in full gear after hours of physical labor, their bodies already drained. They ran drills where every piece of equipment malfunctioned, forcing improvisation with whatever remained. And through it all, the fire kept coming. Relentless, predictable in its physics, merciless in its consumption. One sailor, near the end of his training, found himself alone in a smoke-filled compartment. His team had been separated during a simulated explosion. His radio was dead. His breathing apparatus had maybe 5 minutes of air left. And somewhere in the black, a fire was spreading. He felt along the bulkhead, counting frames, navigating by memory. His training said, find the fuel source, seal it, then retreat. Don't try to fight the fire alone. Don't be a hero. Survive. He found the valve by touch, turned it until the fuel flow stopped, heard the fire begin to die, not extinguished, but starved. Then he retraced his steps, following the hose line back to the hatch, back to breathable air. When he emerged, the instructor was waiting. You followed procedure, the instructor said. That's all we ask. The sailor nodded, still catching his breath. It's not about being brave, the instructor continued. It's about being disciplined. Brave men die if they don't have discipline. Disciplined men survive, and keep everyone else alive too. That night, the sailors gathered in the barracks, exhausted and silent. They'd been at the school for 8 weeks. They'd fought hundreds of fires. They'd memorized procedures, calculations, priorities. They'd learned to suppress fear, manage chaos, and execute doctrine under conditions designed to break them. And now, they were ready. Not because they were fearless, but because they understood that fire, like war, was a logistics problem, and logistics could be solved. Chapter 8. The Doctrine. They carried graduation wasn't ceremonial. There were no speeches, no medals, no assembled families. The sailors simply received their orders, assignments to destroyers, carriers, cruisers scattered across the Pacific and Atlantic. They packed their gear, said brief goodbyes, and shipped out. But they carried something invisible, a doctrine forged in smoke and heat, a way of thinking that prioritized systems over heroics, preparation over improvisation, logistics over luck. They would join damage control parties aboard ships that hadn't yet been hit. They would train their shipmates in the procedures they'd learned. They would inspect equipment, test systems, and prepare for the fires that statistics said were inevitable. And when those fires came, from torpedoes, kamikaze strikes, mechanical failures, or simple accidents, they would respond not with panic, but with the cold mathematics of survival. Some would save ships. Some would watch ships sink despite their efforts. Some would die in the attempt, but all of them carried the same truth. Fire is a logistics problem, and logistics can be taught, trained, systematized, and executed even when the world is burning around you. Years later, after the war, the school would be decommissioned, the burned compartments dismantled, the mock-up ships scrapped for steel, but the doctrine remained, passed down through naval training programs, refined by new technologies, adapted to new threats. Because the lesson wasn't specific to World War II, it was universal. Survival at sea requires not just brave sailors, but disciplined sailors. Not just powerful ships, but resilient ships. Not just superior firepower, but superior logistics. The sailors who passed through that school understood this better than most. They'd learned it in smoke-filled compartments, in exhaustion-driven drills, in the quiet moments after a fire was finally extinguished when they realized they'd survived, not because they were lucky but because they'd been prepared. And that preparation, unglamorous, methodical, relentlessly focused on systems and supplies and procedures, had saved more lives than any weapon ever could. Chapter 9. The Fire That Remains. The war ended. The sailors dispersed. Some stayed in the Navy, becoming instructors themselves, passing the doctrine to new generations. Some returned to civilian life, carrying scars and memories they rarely discussed. Some never made it home. But the truth they'd learned remained. Fire, like war, is a logistics problem. It spreads according to knowable rules. It can be predicted, contained, and suppressed if the systems are in place, if the training is rigorous, if the discipline holds. Decades later, archives would reveal the statistics. Ships that had trained damage control parties suffered fewer casualties and catastrophic losses. Ships with well-maintained firefighting systems stayed operational longer after taking hits. Ships whose crews understood the logistics of survival brought more sailors home. The school that burned on purpose had proven its worth not in headlines or commendations, but in the quiet survival of vessels that should have sunk, crews that should have perished, and missions that continued despite catastrophic damage. It wasn't heroism, it was engineering. And engineering, applied with discipline and foresight, had saved thousands of lives. The sailors who graduated from that school rarely spoke of their time there. The burns, the drills, the exhaustion, none of it made for dramatic stories. There were no medals for inspecting hose connections, no monuments to those who memorized fuel line schematics, no songs about the logistics officers who ensured foam canisters remained in stock. But in the silent work of preparation, in the unglamorous discipline of maintaining systems, in the cold mathematics of oxygen deprivation and compartment isolation, they had found something more enduring than glory, the fragile, persistent engineering of survival. And perhaps that was the real lesson. That war is won not just on battlefields, but in supply chains, not just by those who can destroy, but by those who can endure, contain, and rebuild, not just through courage but through the quiet competence of sailors who understood that fire is a logistics problem, and that logistics, executed with precision and care, could save the world from burning. The school closed, the fires went out, but the doctrine remained, a testament to the truth that even in the worst chaos, even in the most desperate circumstances, survival is possible if the systems hold, and the systems held because sailors made them hold. Not with miracles, but with training. Not with luck, but with logistics. Not with heroism alone, but with the disciplined understanding that fire, like war, obeys rules, and that those who learn the rules can survive what others cannot. In the end, the fire was never truly defeated. It remained, a constant threat, a physical law, an enemy that could not be bargained with or intimidated, but it could be managed, contained, suppressed long enough for the ship to reach port, for the crew to evacuate, for the mission to continue. And in that management, in that fragile balance between destruction and survival, the sailors found their purpose, not to conquer fire, but to outlast it, to keep the systems running, to bring their shipmates home. That was the victory. Quiet, unglamorous, enduring. Subscribe to our channel to uncover more hidden stories of World War II, stories of resilience, memory, and redemption. Thank you for watching.